Book 6, Flight to the Wounded Falcon, Chapter 25. I've always been able to count on you. Dec rode fast with his son Vidro and nephew Newell toward the Idumean Trail, the southernmost route to the ancient temple site. It was a race, after all, but his heart wasn't in it. No one's was. He had hoped the speed of the horse would help jar the odd feeling that accompanied him, but so far that hadn't happened. Early that morning, much of the family had met again to say goodbye to the men heading to the routes, but it wasn't anything like the laughing, teasing departure of less than a season ago. First, there were no little ones, just wives and mothers saying goodbye, and Con and Sam Cadby were too busy helping their father and neighbors with the grape harvest to take 2 days off. Second, they were breaking up into separate groups. It felt wrong for Dec to watch his Cephas go with Pato, Boscos, and Zadok. They'd be remarking the backdoor route, which hadn't seen anyone for 6 years. While it was the shortest and quickest route, it was also the steepest and most dangerous. That's why they had newly official Dr. Boscosinas, who had recently passed his final exams. They also had to find an emergency storage cavern, so they needed an extra man. But splitting up the families. Dec knew Pato felt it as well. He had patted Dec on the back before they left and whispered, "I'll take good care of your Cephas, I promise, just like you'll watch my Newell." The rest of the men and teenage boys were divided up to take the 3 other routes. Campbell Brighter led one group. Lex Zenas, who became father to Perrin Zenas only 3 days earlier, took another, and Ralph Shin led the third. Shem wasn't coming either, but he had seen them off with a prayer that promised those staying at home that each man would return safely this time. But Mari insisted on tearfully hugging and kissing each one again. That morning, she was worse than Grandma Travato. Noticeably missing were 2 men named Perrin Shin. That was the oddest part of all. These trips had always been led by the general, and as the men mounted their horses, they half expected to hear his deep voice bellowing that it was long past time to go. Instead, there was only a subdued Shem wishing them well and expecting them home for a family dinner the next evening. Dec was rarely a man to show emotion, but as he nudged his horse over to Shem, he felt his chin trembling. "Sure you can't come along, guide? Doesn't seem right to be going to the temple site without you." Shem patted Dec's leg. "I have 3 ill assistants, and we're a little backed up because of everything." Then he sighed and added in a whisper, "There are a great many things not right today, Dec Brighter. Thank you for being one of the things that is. I've always been able to count on you." Dec cleared his throat, nodded to the guide, and clucked his horse into a gallop before anyone could see the tears in his eyes. They were riding light, with only a pack for their food and a bedroll. Pato had tried to lift the mood of the day by suggesting they race to see which route was the fastest from the estates. Ralph's group, finishing up the northern route, had protested the idea. "We have the farthest to go," Q reminded his father. "Yes, you do," Pato acknowledged, "but that route is mostly marked, and you won't be stopping by your grandmother's either. Besides, whoever gets to the site first also has to gather all the firewood for the evening." "So it might be good to come in last?" Pato nodded. "That's the way races in Salem are supposed to work, Q." Almost everyone had laughed, even though it wasn't that funny. They just needed something to get them smiling. Pato barely twitched his mouth. No one had seen him smile in the nearly 2 weeks since young Pear had bolted. It wasn't long before Dec, Vidro, and Newell reached the southernmost trail. They called it the Idumean Trail because it paralleled the canyon Guide Glease had envisioned would be the route of the army of Idumea. Their route went straight through the forest, up the steep hillside, and followed along the tops of the peaks that curved and split. Taking the right-hand fork of the split led travelers directly to the temple site. Taking the left hand led them back down into the dead valley. The men slowed their horses as they approached the first 2 marked trees signaling the trailhead, and pulled out their knives. Vidro nodded at his cousin and, leaning from his horse, deepened the slashes on the tree. He and Newell proceeded to ride into the trees, but Dec didn't continue. He just remained, staring at the forest. A moment later, Vidro and Newell came back out. "Papa, something wrong?" Vidro asked. When Deck didn't answer, the cousins looked at each other, shrugged, and rode back to Deck. He smiled dimly before whispering, "Rector Shin, how look the trees?" Newell and Vidro glanced sadly at each other as they remembered their grandfather's routine before entering any trail. "Very well," Newell said quietly, saying his father's part. He didn't finish with General Shin, but skipped to the next line. "Guide Zenas, shall we continue?" Vidro wiped his nose on his sleeve. "Of course, it's a beautiful day to do the Creator's work." Deck nodded once. "Please tell me there's not much more to this," his voice cracked, "because I'm already getting hungry. Let's get moving." "Let's get moving," his son and nephew repeated quietly. Private Shin fell onto his new cot in exhaustion and pain. His ears were blazing, this time because the bits of metal and glass recently embedded into the tops had been removed. "Can't have the sun glinting off your taggings and giving away your position," was the explanation, while several new recruits spent time flinching in the surgery wing under the indelicate hands of the surgeon's assistants. At first, Shin welcomed the idea of resting on the cots after running in the surprisingly hot harvest sun. But when he realized there was no fog to cover the pain, he began to envy those dropping outside from dehydration, who were now dragged past him to another part of the surgery. Shin had asked if they could numb his ears, but the surgeon shook his head. "Don't need sedation for just that." "Not sedation, sir." Pear winced as the assistant pulled out another jagged piece of metal. "Just the brown stuff." "What brown stuff?" the surgeon demanded. "The numbing agent," he gasped. "What you use before stitching numbs the flesh of the area." "I've never heard of anything like that. You Gracina boys, you see all kinds of things no one else does. Just bite down and tough it out like a real soldier. You'll be done in half an hour." He made a mental note to be more careful in the future with what he said. He probably would have learned in Woodson's training that the numbing agent tragically didn't exist in the world. On his way out of the surgery wing, he stopped and looked at himself in the mirror. The last time he saw himself properly was in Salem. He'd been avoiding this, even after his first bath and fitting for his uniform. But having his taggings removed, he decided it was time to see what the worldly Private Shin looked like. He wasn't prepared for what greeted him. He couldn't pull his gaze away from his ears. Even though the taggings had been there for less than 2 weeks, the rough and now bleeding cuts across the top of his ears would leave scars that would not fade quickly, if ever. He could never go back to the unscarred ears, but if he had to choose between the taggings and the scars, he preferred the scars. He tried next to look into his eyes, but couldn't focus on himself, as if his eyes refused to acknowledge the person in the mirror. Instead, he searched his face. It was more worn and rough than he remembered, and he seemed to have lost a little weight. Still, it was a good look for a soldier, and he looked less like Perrin Shin the Elder. He tried to smile at himself, now wearing the basic blue jacket and trousers, but he gave up as soon as he tried. Wondering fleetingly what Pugga would think of him in a uniform, he felt a flicker of hope. At least here he was safe. He was fed, clothed, and away from girls like Lolo and Amory and temptations to get fogged. He stepped out of the building into the hot sunshine. The snugness of his uniform gave him a sense of security, and he could understand why Pugga had liked the army. He was now, entirely and wholly, Private Shin. They'd told him to live, think, believe, and act like army, every moment of every day. There was no more Pear or Perrin or especially young Pear, only the private. The army was now his salvation. He walked to the barracks and lay down on his cot for a few minutes, as the surgeon had ordered. For some reason, his thoughts were filled with his mother. He thought he could see her weeping as she did when he jumped off the schoolhouse roof, but he shook the thought away. She had 12 other children to worry about. She didn't have room or time to worry about him. Having the troublemaker gone was probably the biggest relief she'd had since he'd been born. Lilla needed to bake. It was the only activity which soothed her, and she needed a lot of soothing with all of the boys and men gone again. They would be back. Shem had gripped her by the arms as she watched miserably out the window as they rode off, and assured her over and over all of them would be back. She stared deep into his blue eyes, but saw no deception. There never was any in his eyes. "Bread," she finally said, as she heard the last of the men and boys' horses leaving the estates. Shem blinked at her. "With dried cranberries and sugar and maybe a glaze on the top." "Sounds delicious, Lilla," Shem told her with a hint of a smile. "You have 3 ill assistants, right?" He nodded. "Fevers, chills. I think they accidentally infected each other at our last meeting." "They need sweet cranberry bread," Lilla decided, "to make them feel better. So does Salima and the boys with Lek away, and maybe another dozen families." "So you'll be all right?" Shem asked cautiously, as Lilla made her way to the pantry and brought out a bag of flour and a crock of dried cranberries. "I don't need to send over Kella." "I'm baking, aren't I?" she shrieked, and slammed down the crock, which shockingly didn't shatter. "I'm making something new, right? I'm going to make everyone feel happy with food." Shem took a protective step backward. While he was used to Lilla's volume, he'd never seen his sister-in-law so on the edge of madness. "Of course you are, and it'll be wonderful as usual." "Of course it will," she agreed dismissively, heading back to the pantry for a bag of sugar. "Everyone loves my cooking. I need to use up these cranberries anyway. He always hated cranberries." She wiped her eyes. "I can clean them out before he returns." She sat down on the stepladder, disheartened. What was he eating? Where was he sleeping? Was he in danger? Was he starving? He was a large boy, and no one could feed him quite as well as his mama. He always came home for dinner. He loved her cooking. He always raided the pantry late at night. How was he surviving? Lilla wasn't at all surprised to feel her oldest sister's arms around her, hugging her from behind. After 10 minutes of sobbing, Calla gently said, "Cranberry sweetbread. Leave it up to you to come up with something that sounds so interesting. How can I help? And let's not use any knives today." With the men on the mountain and the university on break for early harvest, Lilla under Calla's control in the kitchen, which would be turning out 3 dozen loaves of cranberry bread, and Jatesy spending the day helping Salima and the boys, Mari decided it was a good day to go back to the temple. Perrin needed to know they were marking the trails, all of them. She found his blue chair, still by the window, and the fat pine tree pushed a little out of the way, but that was all right. She didn't need privacy. She sat down on the chair, closed her eyes, but he didn't come. Not like last time. She meditated, she pondered. She asked the Creator to let him know about the trails. Still nothing. Come on, she thought. Just for 5 seconds, that's all she needed. Then she remembered she didn't need him, but wanted him. Well, that should be enough, right? She closed her eyes again, squeezing them tight almost childishly, as if she had to go through some little routine to get her way. After a few minutes, she felt her father. "No, you don't need him," she murmured softly, "but my heart does." Mari. Her father wasn't alone. Today, Mari felt distinctly that her mother was there too, and she grinned at the sensation. A handful of times she'd felt her mother, and she knew Heisemum was there as support. She and her father were there together forever. She'd known before in her heart that her parents had accepted the agreement she and Perrin had done for them in the temple. But moments like this reminded her just how wonderfully binding it could be. But if you can both be here, surely he can too. There were more coming, and Mari felt they were just beyond her range of perception, just slightly out of focus for her soul's eyes to see. but she felt them, and that awareness was more intense than merely seeing. She smiled as she felt Ralph and Joriana together, and if she could only go a little bit further, just a little deeper, she was sure she would find their son Perrin. Two more came to her, and she recognized them too. Tabit and Hogel Densel, always together. She nearly opened her arms to embrace everyone, but she knew she'd get some looks from others in the temple, wondering just what poor lonely Mrs. Shin was up to now. Instead, she grinned, and knew the Densels grinned back. But you can go no further. It was distinctly Hogel Densel, and her mind felt as if it were hitting a block wall. On either side of her now seemed to be Hysamum and Joriana, as if ready to escort her somewhere. "No," Mari whispered urgently. "He's here, just a bit further." "No, Mari." That was distinctly Joriana. "You have to let him go for now. He can't come back to you. Not yet." "Why not?" "You know why not." That was her father, Cephas. "We all heard what you made him promise." Drat, she thought. To never leave young Pear's side? And he won't. There was another one, definitely Ralph. Young Pear needs him, especially right now, especially where he is. You don't need him, Mari. "Is he in the army?" Mari breathed. No one answered her. No one needed to. "Don't tell Lilla." She had the impression no one was planning to. "But he knows what's going on at home, Mari." Hogel. "He's not alone with young Pear. I'm his companion, seeing as how I had so much experience with rebellious young men named Perrin." Mari could almost feel his eyebrows waggling, and she nearly giggled. "He knows about the men marking the trails. He knows about the new baby's arrival. He knows everything." "And he knows how much I miss him." "That goes without saying, Mari. Let him do his job, and you do yours." "And what's that?" she whispered despondently. "Saying the wrong things to my grandchildren to chase them away?" "Mari." That was her mother, she was sure of it. "How many times did I say the wrong things to you, yet I didn't chase you away?" That time Mari did chuckle softly. "Thank you," she whispered to all of them, "for coming, for tolerating my loneliness, my childishness." There was loving chuckling in return. "You still have a great work to do." That was Tabit. "I tried to tell you the night after Perrin joined us." "I know, Calla told me." "And as Perrin said, all of this is only temporary." "It feels like a lifetime already." "When you're on our side, you realize just how brief a lifetime is. Just wait." "What's the work I have to do? How will I know it when I've done it?" Her father answered, "You'll know. Everyone will know." Deck's group was the second to the ancient temple site that afternoon. His son Cambo's group had, as expected, arrived first, taking the route which started just beyond Deck's pasture lands. Ralph and Q Shin, with Hauling Brighter, arrived a few minutes after Deck. Q was thrilled that they hadn't lost, and that his brother Hogel and cousins Cambo and Bubba had already gathered enough firewood for the night. Now some of them walked around the ancient temple ruins waiting for Pato and Lex groups, while others lay down in the grass and enjoyed the warm sunshine. Deck walked to the edge of the large tableland and looked down at the lush green silent valley in front of him. He sat down and wondered when he would be back again, and why they wouldn't be coming for a time, as Guide Zenas put it. While the air was usually dry in Salem, here it always felt heavier and humid. Today it was saturated. Deck found it difficult to fully fill his lungs, and it made him nervous. He didn't like sitting around, staring into that peaceful valley which waited for bloodshed. Even though Shem had promised no one would be injured, Deck felt the need to go find the other 7 men. A voice in the distance caught his attention. And the next winner is, although we don't have winners, Lek Zenas and Company. Dek turned around to see Lek, Wes Hafati, and Barnos Shin arrive through a break in the trees, smiling and waving. Dek jogged over to them. Any news of Pato? Sometimes you can see the back door from the upper middle route. Barnos nodded. We spied Papa not too long ago. They should be here soon. Dek breathed a little easier. Good. He didn't finish, but headed over to the forested area where the backdoor route would finish. He walked through the trees up the incline about 20 paces, where the upper ridge of the bowl of the mountains dipped a little. He reached the top of the ridge and looked down the other side. The last 200 or so paces up that section were grueling. It was a climb up a steep rock face. Sure-footed children and healthy adults could handle it, but the elderly, expecting women, and little children would struggle. Dek sighed in relief when he saw 4 horses on long tethers for the night at the bottom of the slope, a few hundred paces below, and 4 men climbing their way up the face. Everyone doing well? Dek called down. Pato looked up. Yes, everyone else get in all right? He placed his hand carefully on another jagged rock and pulled himself up. Dek nodded. You're the last ones in. All the firewood collected? Called Zadok Zenas from the bottom of the rock face. Sure is. Then we win. Dek smiled and sat down on top of the ridge to watch their progress. Come on down, Papa, Cephas called up. You can jump from there, roll down that steep grassy area, and join us in climbing back up. As tempting as that sounds, son, Dek said, making sure his sarcasm was obvious. I don't think Boscos needs to practice stitching my flesh or binding my bones today. Zadok chuckled. No, he's already had a bit of doctoring practice. Zad, Bosco said with some irritation, crawling upward a few paces ahead of his younger brother. Pato reached the top of the ridge and took his brother-in-law's outstretched hand. He held on to it for a moment. Thank you for not jumping. Cephas and Zadok plan to go down that way tomorrow to see if they can. It was young Pear's theory that he didn't get to test 6 years ago. Broken arm. I guess Bosco's better be ready. To be honest, Dek, I've been feeling uneasy all day, he said quietly. When everyone is at the site, I might be able to rest my mind. Why do you think I'm up here watching for you? Dek slapped Pato on the back. I haven't been able to keep a clear head either. I think Bosco's had the same problem, Pato said, watching as Cephas reached the top. He took a bit of a spill earlier. Is he all right? Yes, as long as you don't talk to him about it. Boscos reached the top a moment later, with fresh cuts and scrapes on his face and arms that Dek ignored, with Zadok close behind. The 5 men jogged through the forest and came out at the ancient temple ruin to be greeted by cheers of welcome. Half an hour later, the men and boys sat around the fire eating their dinner and talking about the condition of their roots. Lek kept eyeing Boscos as they ate, and finally asked, So, boss, the scratches? Zadok grinned at Cephas and elbowed him, but Cephas shook his head in warning. Everyone watched for Boscos' response. He groaned before he answered, I slipped. Lek tried not to smirk. Slipped on what, boss? Unsure, he said, taking a bite of his dinner. Oh, I saw what it was, Zadok offered, too eagerly. What was it, Zad? Lek asked his youngest brother. A flower, Zadok snorted. Cephas tried to keep his face straight for Bosco's benefit, but nearly everyone else burst into laughter. Even Pato smiled. Newell noticed, and nodded to Ralph to look at their father. Ralph elbowed Barnes, and the 2 of them smiled at their father's briefly lighter mood. A flower? Dek asked carefully. Bosco sighed. Not an average flower. Barely fit the definition. Some big, smelly, slimy thing on the rock up the trail, after we tethered the horses. He stepped on it, Zadok announced, and the next thing we know, he's rolling down the hill back to the horses. Lek tried to stifle his snort as his brother and cousins laughed. I'm sorry, boss, but a flower? That is funny. Anything permanently injured? Boscos finally looked up from his dinner with a reluctant smile. Only my dignity. Papa's still a true guide. The men chuckled, and Peto's smile remained. After a moment, he quietly said, Father hated that route. Everyone stopped laughing to listen. Boscos knows why now. That last climb, try taking that in the snowing season. Ralph's eyebrows rose. Papa, you did that in the snow? I was so eager to see if it could be another route, Peto explained. When we first started scouting for paths, I didn't want to wait for the snow to melt. Besides, I reasoned we should try the routes in all kinds of weather. I was around 18 and a bit heartsick over a girl with a loud laugh who didn't notice me at a wedding some time before. I needed a distraction. Was she at our papa's wedding? Maybe our mama's youngest sister? Lek asked with a knowing smile. Peto nodded. My father was so eager for me to find a way to feel needed in Salem for our first year here that he agreed to do just about anything, even explore the back door. I didn't realize it at the time, but he was worried about avalanches. Apparently Shem had told him a few stories, and when he saw large swaths of forest that were wiped out by snowslides, he was even less thrilled about going. But he did. He knew it was important to me, so he went. Peto stopped for a moment and stared at the fire. Dek broke the silence. Tell them what happened, Peto. Peto's dim smile returned. We left the horses down by the river, as we did today. Then we climbed all the way to the top to see where it came out. That's when Father tried to sit down to rest and slipped instead. Peto looked at Boscos. But he tumbled more than a couple of paces, boss. He slid, and boy, did he slide on that snow. Peto began to grin for the first time in weeks, all the way down the entire slope. The men began to smile, and the teenage boys laughed. And did he stop when he reached the horses? Peto continued. Nope. He kept on sliding right past them. They even turned and watched him zip on by. Now everyone was laughing. Peto almost did. The only thing that stopped him was the river. One big crash. I could hear the ice breaking from where I was at the summit. He must have been freezing, Hogel said in awe. Just about, Peto told his 12-year-old son. But he was also furious, and that kept him warm. I came down to help him, but I don't think I ever quit laughing. And he could hear me. That canyon echoes, if you haven't noticed. You see, it wasn't a gentle slide. No, not General Shin. He fought it all the way down, flailing and kicking and tumbling. He even took out some innocent little evergreens. I was sure I heard a few army words echo through that canyon. I don't think these mountains ever heard such language before. Even Dek was laughing. Peto finally chuckled. I remember when they came home, Dek said. They were a day early, and Perrin was still chilled to the bone, including his hair. Mari had wanted him to cut some of those longer locks, but he had refused. Since he and Shem had left the army, they hadn't cut their hair at all. They were both looking rather scruffy by then. He had to let Mari cut it when he came home, though, because when Peto fished him out of the river, some of Perrin's hair was already freezing, and Peto broke off a lock just to see if he could. Peto finally laughed, along with everyone else. His sons watched him in delight, reveling in the sound. He was all lopsided in the back, Peto chuckled. My mother thanked me later for making him have to get a trim. Peto watched the fire and laughed again at the memory. It was his idea, you know, he said softly. Finding the emergency storage cavern today. Everyone fell silent as they watched Peto. I was going through his desk a few weeks ago and found his last notes. One thing he wrote was for us to find an emergency storage spot on the backdoor route. Knowing him, Boscos, he had that ugly flower grow there just to get you to slip, just to get me to remember our first trip. His chin trembled, but he looked up at his nephew. Thanks for tumbling. Boscos nodded back. Anytime. It looked like the kind of flower Uncle Perrin would design, not really his talent. Uncle Pato, Cephas said, I've never seen anything like it in these mountains or in the books. Maybe we could name it the one-of-a-kind ugly? Agreed, Pato grinned. Boscos looked up to the stars beginning to appear. But Uncle Perrin, he called, couldn't you have put that hideous thing a little lower on the trail? Everyone burst out laughing again, and Pato nodded and wiped at his eyes. As they set up their bedrolls around the fire, Dec felt a bit more at ease. At their family prayer before bed, his son Bubba prayed that they would all reach home safely again, especially the one who was farthest from home. No one had said his name that day besides Pato, but it was clear young Pear was on everyone's minds. Even after they began to lie down for the night, Pato continued to sit by the fire, poking it with a long stick. Dec sat next to him. I have to confess, I couldn't enter the forest until we did the little routine. Pato glanced at him and smiled. You too? Your Cephas started it for us. Cambo told me he and Bubba and Hogel made it to the second set of trees before they realized something felt wrong, Dec said. They rode back out to the forest and asked Rector Shin how the trees looked before they continued on. Pato poked the fire again. Lek, Barnos, and Wes had a little argument as to who'd start it. They voted that Lek should begin since he was the oldest. And Ralph told me that he and Q and your Halling had already planned to do it before they ever arrived at the northern route. Maybe that's why they made such good time. Dec sighed. I always thought it was a silly tradition, but today it meant so much to me. Somehow it invoked his permission. Pato nodded, not caring about the tear that slid down his cheek. Have you felt him recently? Dec whispered. Pato shook his head. No, he left when young Pear did. That's what Jatesy and I thought, and that's all right. That's who needs him most now. We all have each other, but... That's the only thing that keeps me going, Dec, Pato confessed. That's what I keep telling Lilla. We know he's watching him. That's why he had to die, Dec. I'm sure of it. The Creator already planned out young Pear's protection before he even made his escape. Dec put an arm around his brother-in-law. Then he has a plan for him to come home as well. Pato's shoulders sagged. If only he will. He's already rejected so many other plans, he could still reject this one. Dec didn't know what to say to that. He just awkwardly hugged his brother-in-law and stared into the fire with him. When Mari arrived home that evening, she was greeted by 3 cheerful girls, Esther Zenas, Susie Brighter, and Canthy Shin. The 15 and 16-year-olds were holding pages expectantly. There you are, Aunt Mari, Esther said. We've been waiting for you. We finished our punny poetry entry for the rectory recital at the end of the week, but we need some critiquing. Yes, Susie said, sounding slightly disappointed. Our mothers all say, it's wonderful, girls. But we know that our mugga, Canthy nodded to her, would actually give us some real advice. Mari smiled. Well, then, let's see what you've created. And she led them back to her wing of the house. After she made herself comfortable on the sofa, the 3 girls launched into their creation. It was a charming tale of 3 bickering crows, although what constitutes bickering in Salem is merely a difference of opinions in the world, and Mari could think of a dozen ways to really heat up their argument. Then there was the rhyme, which really wasn't a rhyme, and the cadence was off in one section, and it would have been better if they'd memorized it, but Canthy, the budding writer, could never remember exactly how words were phrased because she kept rewriting as she went, and that joke fell a bit flat, but if they... She stopped with her mental list, because suddenly all she could see before her was the memory of young Pear, scowling after he'd experienced Mari Shin, critic at large, and how it had chased him away. Oh, sure, her mother reminded Mari that nothing Heisemum ever said chased Mari away, but Heisemum had been a sweet, silly, shallow woman, incapable of chasing away even a squirrel with a broom. She'd had nothing of Mari's caustic nature, which, even after 25 years in Salem, she still struggled to keep from bubbling over. Her heart sank to her knees as she watched the 3 darling girls who she loved so much do their best, their eyes darting over to her as they read their lines, anxious for her approval and likely fearing her criticism. They had done their best. Who was Mari to point out anything more? What if one of these dear girls was silently at the edge of some breaking point, like young Pear, and the very next words that would come out of Mari's mouth might be the ones that shoved her over? No, she couldn't do it. She wouldn't do it. She wouldn't be responsible for sending another grandchild away to prove some point to Mugga. The girls were finished, clutching their pages earnestly and waiting for her judgment. Mari beamed as brightly as she could. That was wonderful, girls. Very charming. I agree with your mothers. Esther grinned, as if having passed some test, and Susie nodded in relief. But Canthe tipped her head. Mugga, didn't that line where the crows were analyzing the carcass feel a little off? Like the rhyming scheme lacked something? Mari pretended to ponder that. Well, perhaps it did, now that I think back on it. But your delivery was so delightful I didn't even notice. You have a few days to work on that line if you really feel you must. Yes, we should probably look at it, Esther said, making a note next to it. Well, if that's it then, that's it, Mari said firmly. I think we should memorize it, Susie said, casting an apologetic glance to Canthe. That way we won't be holding the pages. Canthe bobbed her head. I'll try. Mari smiled sadly to herself. See, they didn't even need her anymore. They spotted the main problems themselves, and she didn't have to make any of them feel worse for it. You're coming, right? Susie asked Mari. To the performance? Mari produced the dinner smile. Of course, wouldn't want to miss it. Private Shin lay in his cot, tired but not as exhausted as the other new recruits. There was something to say for having been raised on an orchard and a cattle ranch. He knew how to work, and it showed. He completed every physical requirement in near record time, while the other flabbier, weaker young men stumbled and flailed. Just minutes ago, the young men had grumbled at the news that they would be rising at dawn to continue their training. But Private Shin merely smiled. That meant he got to sleep in an extra hour than he would have if he still lived over the mountain. A few days later, Mari didn't go to the girls' performance of the Squabbling Crows. She claimed to be suffering from a headache. A worldly lie, but a convenient one. She also didn't attend the concert that several of the children were in the next day, claiming that she was tired. And when Vidro brought her a paper to review for his class, she suggested that his mother Jatsi critique it instead. Soon she realized she had to vary her excuses, because after her 3rd headache, Lila insisted that Boscos examine her for something more serious. So over the next couple of weeks, Mari developed minor joint pains, or needed to work on something for her classes, then discovered that being a baby tender was the best thing she could do with her evenings, letting her adult grandchildren have a night out. It wasn't as if anything she said to toddlers would push any of them into the world. If anyone came to her door, she turned them away, with a reassuring smile, and saying only that she was busy at the moment, but maybe later. Because she was determined to never, ever say the wrong thing to any of them again. And that's the end of that chapter. Thank you.